Hello, third grade. I'm back with On the Banks of Plum Creek, and we are up to chapter 24, which is called Going to Church. It was Saturday night, and Pa sat on the doorstep smoking his after-supper pipe. Laura and Mary sat close on either side of him. Ma, with Carrie in her lap, rocked gently to and fro just inside the doorway. The winds were still. The stars hung low and bright. The dark sky was deep beyond the stars, and Plum Creek talked softly to itself. "They told me in town this afternoon that they would be preaching in the new church tomorrow," said Pa. "I met the home missionary, Reverend Alden, and he wanted us to be sure to come. I told him we would." "Oh, Charles," Ma exclaimed, "we haven't been to church in so long." Laura and Mary had never seen a church, but they knew from Ma's voice that going to church must be better than a party. After a while, Ma said, "I'm so glad I finished my new dress." "You'll look sweet as a posy in it," Pa told her. "We must start out early." Next morning was a hurry. Breakfast was a hurry, work was a hurry, and Ma hurried about dressing herself and Carrie. She called up the ladder in a hurrying voice. "Come on down, girls. I'll tie your ribbons." They hurried down. Then they stood and stared at Ma. She was perfectly beautiful in her new dress. It was black and white calico, a narrow stripe of white, then a wider stripe of black lines and white lines no wider than threads. Up the front, it was buttoned with black buttons, and the skirt was pulled back and lifted up to puffs behind it. Crocheted lace edged the little stand-up collar. Crocheted lace spread out in a bow on Ma's chest, and a gold breast piece held the collar and the bow. And Ma's face was lovely. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. She turned Laura and Mary around and quickly tied the ribbons on their braids. Then she took Carrie's hand. They all went onto the doorstep and Ma locked the door. Carrie looked like one of those little angel birds in the Bible. Her dress and her tiny sunbonnet were white and trimmed with lace. Her big eyes were solemn. Her golden curls hung by her cheeks and peeped out from under the bonnet below. Then Laura saw her own pink ribbons on Mary's braids. She clapped her hand over her mouth before a word came out. She scrooged and looked down her own back. Mary's blue ribbons were on her braids. She and Mary looked at each other and did not say a word. Ma, in her hurry, had made a mistake. They hoped she would not notice. Laura was so tired of pink, and Mary was so tired of blue. But Mary had to wear blue because her golden hair, and Laura had to wear pink because her hair was brown. Pa came driving the wagon from the stable. He had brushed Sam and David till they shone in the morning sun. They stepped proudly, tossing their heads and their manes, and their tails rippled. There was a clean blanket on the wagon seat and another one spread on the bottom of the wagon box. Pa carefully helped Ma climb up over the wheel. He lifted Carrie to Ma's lap. Then he tossed Laura into the wagon box, and her braids flew out. "Oh, dear," Ma exclaimed. "I put the wrong ribbons on Laura's hair." "It'll never be noticed on a trotting horse," said Pa, so Laura knew she could wear the blue ribbons. Sitting beside Mary on the clean blanket in the window bottom, she pulled her braids over her shoulder. So did Mary, and they smiled at each other. Laura could see the blue whenever she looked down, and Mary could see the pink. Pa was whistling as he rode. Ma reminded him softly that this was Sunday. Then they all sang together. "There's a happy land far, far away, where saints in glory stand, bright, bright as day." Plum Creek came out of the willow shadows and spread wide and flat and twinkling in the sunshine. Sam and David trotted through the sparkling shallows. Glittering drops flew up and waves splashed from the wheels. Then they were on the endless prairie. The wagon rolled softly along the road and hardly made a mark in the green grasses. Birds sang their morning songs, bees hummed, great yellow bumblebees went bumbling from flower to flower, and big grasshoppers flew swirling up and away. Too soon they came to town. The blacksmith shop was shut and still. The doors of the stores were closed. A few dressed-up men and women with their dressed-up children walked along the edges of the dusty main street. They were all going toward the church. The church was a new building not far from the schoolhouse. Pa drove toward it through the prairie grass. It was like the schoolhouse, except that on its roof was a tiny room with no walls and nothing in it. "What's that?" Laura asked. Don't point, Laura, said Ma. That's the belfry. A belfry is where the church bells hang. Pa stopped the wagon against the high porch of the church. He helped Ma out of the wagon, but Laura and Mary just stepped over the side of the wagon box. They all waited there while Pa drove into the shade of the church, unhitched Sam and David, and tied them to the wagon box. People were coming through the grass, climbing the steps, and going into the church. There was a solemn, low rustling inside. At last, Pa came. He took Carrie on his arm, and he walked with Ma into the church. Laura and Mary walked softly, close behind them. They all sat in a row on a long bench. Church was exactly like a schoolhouse, except that it had a strange, large, hollow feeling. Every little noise was loud against the new board walls. A tall, thin man stood up behind the tall desk on the platform. His clothes were black, and his big cravat was black, and his hair and his beard that went around his face were dark. His voice was gentle and kind. All the heads bowed down. The man's voice talked to God for a long time, while Laura sat perfectly still and looked at the blue ribbon on her braids. Suddenly, right beside her, a voice said, "Come with me." Laura almost jumped out of her skin. A pretty lady stood there, smiling out of soft blue eyes. The lady said again, "Come with me, little girls. We're going to have a Sunday school class." Ma nodded to them, so Laura and Mary slid down from the bench. They had not known there was going to be school on Sunday. The lady led them to the corner. All the girls from school were there, looking questions at each other. The lady pulled benches around to make a square. She sat down and took Laura and Christy beside her. When the others were settled on the square of the benches, the lady said her name was Mrs. Tower, and she asked them their names. Then she said, "Now I'm going to tell you a story." Laura was very pleased, but Mrs. Tower began, "It's all about a little baby born long, long ago in Egypt. His name was Moses." So Laura did not listen anymore. She knew all about Moses. Even Carrie knew about Moses. After the story, Mrs. Tower smiled more than ever and said, "Now we'll all learn a Bible verse. Won't that be nice?" "Yes, ma'am," they all said. She told a Bible verse to each girl. They were to remember their verse and repeat it the next Sunday. That was their Sunday school lesson. When it was Laura's turn, Mrs. Tower cuddled her and smiled, almost as warm and sweet as Ma. She said, "My very littlest girl must have a very small lesson. It will be the shortest verse in the Bible." Then Laura knew what it was, but Mrs. Tower's eyes smiled and said, "It's just 3 words." She said them and asked, "Now, do you think you can remember that for a whole week?" Laura was surprised at Mrs. Tower. Why, she remembered long Bible verses and whole songs. But she did not want to hurt Mrs. Tower's feelings, so she just said, "Yes, ma'am." "That's my little girl," Mrs. Tower said. But Laura was Ma's little girl. "I'll tell you again to help you remember just these 3 words," said Mrs. Tower. "Now, can you say them after me?" Laura squirmed. "Try," Mrs. Tower urged her. Laura's head bowed lower and she whispered the verse. "That's right," said Miss Tower. "Now, will you do your best to remember and tell me next Sunday?" Laura nodded. After that, everyone stood up. They all opened their mouths and tried to sing Jerusalem the Golden. Not many of them knew the words to the tune. Miserable squiggles went up Laura's backbone, and the insides of her ears crinkled. She was glad when they all sat down again. Then the tall, thin man stood up and talked. All right, here's them singing the song with the Sunday school teacher. Laura thought that man would never stop talking. She looked through the open windows at the butterflies going where they pleased. She watched the grass blowing in the wind. She listened to the wind whimpering thin along the edges of the roof. She looked at the blue ribbons in her hair. She looked at each of her fingernails and admired how the fingers of her hands would fit together. She stuck her fingers out straight so they looked like the corner of a log house. She looked at the underneath of the shingles. Her legs ached from dangling still. At last, when everyone stood up and tried again to sing, when that was over, there was no more. They could all go home. The tall, thin man was standing by the door. He was the Reverend Alden. He shook Ma's hand, and then he shook Pa's hand, and they talked. Then he bent down and shook Laura's hand. His teeth smiled in his dark beard. His eyes were warm and blue. He asked, Did you like Sunday school, Laura? Suddenly, Laura did like it, so she said, Yes, sir. Then you must come every Sunday, he said. We will expect you. And Laura knew he already would expect her. He would not forget. On the way home, Pa said, Well, Caroline, it's pleasant to be with a crowd of people, all trying to do the right thing, same as we are. Yes, Charles, said Ma thankfully. It will be a pleasure to look forward to it all week. Pa turned on the seat and asked the girls, How did you girls like the first time you ever went to church? They can't sing, said Laura. Pa's great laugh rang out. Ha, ha, ha. Then he explained, There was nobody there to pitch the hymn with a tuning fork. Nowadays, Charles, said Ma, people have hymn books. Well, maybe we'll be able to afford some someday, Pa said. After that, they went... Scout. Shh. Sorry, it's my dog. Come here, Scout. Shh, 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 shh. After that, they went to Sunday school every day. 3 or 4 Sundays, they went to Sunday school. And then again, Reverend Alden was there, and that was Church Sunday. The Reverend Alden lived in his real church in the East. He could not travel all the way to this church every Sunday. This was his home missionary church in the West. There were no more long, dull, tiresome Sundays because there was always Sunday school to go to and to talk about afterward. The best Sundays were the Sundays when Reverend Alden was there. He always remembered Laura, and she remembered him between times. He called Laura and Mary his little country girls. Then one Sunday, while Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura were all sitting at the dinner table talking about that day's Sunday school, Pa said, If I'm going to keep up going out with dressed up folks, I must get a new pair of boots. Look. He stretched out his foot. His mended boots were cracked clear across the toes. They all looked at his red knitted socks showing through. The edges of the leather were thin and curling. Pa said, It won't hold another patch. Oh, I wanted you to get boots, Charles, Ma said, and you brought home that calico for my dress. Pa made up his mind. I'll get me a new pair when I go into town next Saturday. They'll cost $3, but we'll make it out somehow till I harvest the wheat. All that week, Pa was making hay. He had helped put up Mr. Nelson's hay and had earned the use of Mr. Nelson's fine, quick mowing machine. He said it was wonderful weather for making hay. He had never known such a dry, sunny summer. Laura hated to go to school. She wanted to be out in the hayfield with Pa, watching the marvelous machine with its long knives snickety-snicking behind the wheels, cutting through the great swaths of grass. Saturday morning, she went to the field on the wagon and helped Pa bring in the last load of hay. They looked at the wheat field, standing up taller than Laura above the mown land. Its level top was rough between wheat heads, bent with the weight of the ripening wheat. They picked 3 long, fat ones and took them to the house to show Ma. When the crop was harvested, Pa said, they'd be out of debt, and they would have more money than they knew what to do with. He would have a buggy, Ma would have a silk dress, and they'd all have new shoes, and they would eat beef every Sunday. After dinner, he put on a clean shirt and took $3 out of the fiddle box. He was going to town to get his new boots. He walked because the horses had been working hard all week, and he left them home to rest. It was late afternoon when Pa came walking home. Laura saw him on the knoll, and she and Jack ran from the old crab's home in the creek and into the house behind him. Ma turned around from the stove where she was taking the Saturday baking out bread out of the oven. Where are your boots, Charles? She asked. Well, Caroline, Pa said, I saw Brother Alden, and he told me he couldn't raise money enough to put a bell into the belfry. The folks in town had all given every cent they could, and he lacked just $3. So I gave him my money. Oh, Charles, said Ma. Pa looked down at his cracked boots. I'll patch it, he said. I can make it hold together somehow. And do you know, we'll hear that church bell ringing clear out here. Ma turned quickly back to the stove, and Laura went quietly out and sat down on the step. Her throat hurt. She did so want Pa to have new boots. Never mind, Caroline, she heard Pa saying. It's not long until we have to wait till I harvest the wheat. Okay, and that's chapter 25. Chapter 26 is kind of long. But I'll read it. Okay, chapter 25 is called The Glittering Cloud. Now the wheat was almost ready to cut. Every day Pa looked at it. Every night he talked about it and showed Laura some long, stiff wheat heads. The plump grains were getting harder in their little husks. Pa said the weather was perfect for ripening wheat. If this keeps up, we'll start harvesting next week. The weather was very hot. The thin, high sky was too hot to look at. Air rose up in waves from the whole prairie as it does from a hot stove. In the schoolhouse, the children panted like lizards, and the sticky pine juice dripped down the board walls. Saturday morning, Laura went walking with Pa to look at the wheat. It was almost as tall as Pa now. He lifted her on his shoulder so that she could see over the heavy bending tops. The field was greeny gold. At the dinner table, Pa told Ma about it. He had never seen such a crop. There were 40 bushels to the acre, and wheat was $1 a bushel. They would be rich now. This was a wonderful country. Now they could have anything they wanted. Laura listened and thought, now Pa could get his new boots. She sat facing the open door, and the sunshine was streaming through it. Something seemed to dim the sunshine. Laura rubbed her eyes and looked again. The sunshine really was dimming. It grew dimmer until there was no sunshine. I do believe a storm is coming, said Ma. There must be a cloud over the sun. Pa got up quickly and went to the door. A storm might hurt his wheat. He looked out, and then he went out. The light was queer, which means strange. It was not like the changed light before a storm. The air did not press down like it did before a storm. Laura was frightened. She did not know why. She ran outdoors where Pa stood looking up at the sky. Ma and Mary came out too, and Pa asked, "What do you make of that, Caroline?" A cloud was over the sun. It was not like any cloud they had ever seen before. It was a cloud of something like snowflakes, but they were larger than snowflakes and thin and glittering. Light shone through each flickering particle. There was no wind. The grasses were still and the air did not stir, but the edge of the cloud came across the sky faster than the wind. The hair stood up on Jack's neck. All at once, he made a frightful sound up at the cloud, a growl and then a whine. Plunk! Something hit Laura's head and fell to the ground. She looked down and saw the largest grasshopper she had ever seen. The huge brown grasshoppers were hitting the ground all around them, hitting her head and her face and her arms. They came thudding down like hail. The cloud was hailing grasshoppers. The cloud was grasshoppers. Their bodies hid the sun and made darkness. Their thin, large wings gleamed and glittered. The rasping whirling of their wings filled the whole air, and they hit the ground and the house with the noise of a hailstorm. Laura tried to beat them off. Their claws clung to her skin and her dress. They looked at her with those bulging eyes, turning their heads this way and that. Mary ran screaming into the house. Grasshoppers covered the ground. There was not one bare bit to step on. Laura had to step on grasshoppers, and they smashed, squirming and sliming under her feet. Ma was slamming the windows shut all around the house. Pa came in and just stood inside the front door looking out. Laura and Jack stood close beside him. Grasshoppers beat down from the sky and swarmed thick all over the ground. Their long wings were folded, and their strong legs took them hopping everywhere. The air whirled, and the roof was sounding like a roof in a hailstorm. Then Laura heard another sound, one big sound made of tiny nips and snips and gnawings. The wheat, Pa shouted. He dashed out the back door and ran toward the wheat field. The grasshoppers were eating the wheat. You could not hear one grasshopper eat unless you listened very well while you held him and fed him grass. Millions and millions of grasshoppers were eating now. You could hear the millions of jaws biting and chewing. Pa came running back to the stable. Through the window, Laura saw him hitching Sam and David, to the wagon. He began pitching old dirty hay from the manure pile into the wagon as fast as he could. Ma ran out, took the other pitchfork, and helped him. Then he drove away down the wheat field, and Ma followed the wagon. Pa drove all around the field, throwing out little piles of stuff as he went. Ma stooped over one, then a thread of smoke rose up from it and spread. Ma lighted pile after pile. Laura watched till a smudge of smoke hid the field and Pa and Ma and the wagon. Wow, this is so scary. Scout, come here. Stop. Shh, 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 shh. Stop barking. Okay, so there's Pa. All those things in the air are grasshoppers. And he's trying to put some hay out onto the wheat. And then there's Ma. And she's making like little fires so that they'll smoke the grasshoppers out. So that the smoke will make the grasshoppers leave before they eat all the wheat. Come here, Scout. Come here. Come here. Scouty, no barking. Sorry, the FedEx just delivered something. Come here. Scout, heel. Come here and stop barking. Good boy. All right, sit down. Good watchdog. Okay, let's find out what happens. Grasshoppers were still falling from the sky. The light was so dim because grasshoppers covered the sun. Ma came back to the house, and in the closed lean-to, she took off her dress and her petticoats and killed the grasshoppers she shook out of them. She had lighted fires all around the wheat field. Perhaps smoke would keep the grasshoppers from eating the wheat. Mary and Ma and Laura were quiet in the shut, smothery house. Carrie was so little that she cried, even when Ma held her in her arms. She cried herself to sleep. Through the walls came the sound of grasshoppers eating. The darkness then went away. The sun shone again. All over the ground was a crawling, hopping mass of grasshoppers. They were eating all the soft, short grass off the knoll. The tall prairie grasses swayed and bent and fell. Oh, look, Laura said, low out the window. They were eating the willow-top tree. The willow branches and leaves were thin with bare twigs sticking out. Whole branches were bare and knobby with masses of grasshoppers. I don't want to look anymore, Mary said, and she went away from the window. Laura did not want to look anymore either, but she could not stop herself from looking. The hens were funny. The two hens and their gawky pullets were eating grasshoppers with all their might. They were used to stretching their necks out low and running fast after grasshoppers and not catching them. Every time they stretched their necks out now, they got a grasshopper right then. They were surprised. They kept stretching out their necks and trying to run in all directions at once. We won't have to buy feed for the hens, said Ma. There's no great loss without some gain. The green garden rows were wilting down. The potatoes, the carrots, the beets, and the beans were being eaten away. The long leaves were eaten off the corn stalks, and the tassels and the ears of the young corn and the green husks fell covered with grasshoppers. There was nothing anyone could do about it. Sometimes Laura saw Pa dimly in it. He stirred up the smoldering fire, and thick smoke hit him again. When it was time to go for Spot, Laura put on stockings and shoes and a shawl. Spot was standing in the old ford of Plum Creek, shaking her skin and switching her tail. The herd went mournfully lowering beyond the old dugout. Laura was sure that the cattle could not eat grass that was full of grasshoppers. If the grasshopper ate all the grass, the cattle would starve. Grasshoppers were thick under her petticoats and on her dress and on her shawl. She kept striking them off her face and hands. Her shoes and Spot's feet crunched grasshoppers. Ma came out in a shawl to do the milking. Laura helped her. They could not keep grasshoppers out of the milk. Ma had brought a cloth to cover the pail, but they could not keep it covered while they milked. Ma skimmed out the grasshoppers with a tin cup. Grasshoppers went into the house with them. Their clothes were full of grasshoppers. Some jumped onto the hot stove where Mary was making supper. Ma covered the food till they chased and smashed every grasshopper. She swept them up and shoveled them into the stove. Pa came in the house long enough to eat supper while Sam and David were eating theirs. Ma did not ask him what was happening to the wheat. She only smiled at him and said, "Don't worry, Charles. We've always gotten along." Pa's throat rasped and Ma said, "Have another cup of tea, Charles. It will help get the smoke out of your throat." When Pa had drunk the tea, he went back to the wheat field with another load of old hay and manure. In bed, Laura and Mary could still hear the whirring and snipping and chewing. Laura felt claws crawling on her. There were no grasshoppers in her bed, but she could not brush the feeling off her arms and cheeks. In the dark, she saw grasshoppers' bulging eyes. She felt their claws crawling until she went to sleep. Pa was not downstairs the next morning. All night, he had been working to keep the smoke off over the wheat, and he did not come to breakfast. He was still working. The whole prairie was changed. The grasses did not wave. They had fallen in ridges. The rising sun made all the prairie rough with shadows where the tall grass had sunk against each other. The willow trees were bare. In the plum thickets, only a few plums hung on the leafless branches. The nipping, clicking, gnawing sound of the grasshoppers eating was still going on. At noon, Pa came driving the wagon out of the smoke. He put Sam and David into the stable and slowly came to the house. His face was black with smoke and his eyeballs were red. He hung his hat on the nail behind the door and sat down at the table. It's no use, Caroline. Smoke won't stop them. They keep dropping down through it and hopping in from all sides. The wheat is falling now. They're cutting it off like a scythe and eating it, straw and all. He put his elbows on the table and hid his face with his hands. Laura and Mary sat still. Only Carrie on her high stool rattled her spoon and reached her little hand toward the bread. She was too young to understand. Never mind, Charles, Ma said. We've been through hard times before. Laura looked down at Pa's patched boots and under the table, and her throat just swelled and ached. Pa could not have new boots now. Pa's hands came down from his face, and he picked up his knife and fork. His beard smiled, but his eyes would not twinkle. They were dull and dim. Don't worry, Caroline. We did all we could. We'll pull through somehow. Then Laura remembered that the new house was not paid for. Pa said he would pay for it when he harvested the wheat. It was a quiet meal, and when it was over, Pa lay down on the floor and went to sleep. Ma slipped a pillow under his head and laid her finger on the lips to tell Laura and Mary to be very still. They took Carrie into the bedroom and kept her quiet with the paper dolls. The only sound was the sound of grasshoppers eating. Day after day, the grasshoppers kept on eating. They ate all the wheat and oats. They ate everything green, all the garden and all the prairie grass. Oh, Pa, what will the rabbits do? Laura asked. And the poor birds. Look around you, Laura, Pa said. The rabbits had all gone away. The little birds of the grass tops were gone. The birds that were left were eating grasshoppers, and prairie hens ran with outstretched necks, gobbling up grasshoppers. When Sunday came, Pa and Laura and Mary walked to Sunday school. The sun was bright and hot, and Ma said she would stay home with Carrie, and Pa left Sam and David in the shady stable. There had been no rain for so long that Laura walked across Plum Creek on dry stones. The whole prairie was brown and dry. Millions of brown grasshoppers whirled low over it. Not a green thing was in sight anywhere. All the way, Laura and Mary brushed off grasshoppers. When they came to the church, brown grasshoppers were thick on their petticoats. They lifted their skirts and brushed them off before they went in. But as careful as they were, the grasshoppers had spit tobacco juice on their best Sunday dresses. Nothing would take out those horrid stains. They would have to wear their best dresses with brown spots on them now. People in town were going back east. Christy and Cassie had to go. Laura said goodbye to Christy, and Mary said goodbye to Cassie, their best friends. They did not go to school anymore. They must save their shoes for winter, and they could not bear to walk barefooted on grasshoppers. School would end soon anyway, and Ma said she would teach them through the winter so they would not get behind their classes when school opened again in the spring. Pa worked for Mr. Nelson and earned the use of Mr. Nelson's plow. He began to plow the bare wheat field to make it ready for next year's wheat crop. And that's the end. Wow. That's a really hard chapter, huh? That must have been terrible. I remember once when I lived in Washington, D.C., they have every 17 years these bugs that are called cicadas come out, and they kind of come out from underground or something wherever they're hibernating. And every 17 years they come, and it was like this in that they were in the air and they were jumping all over you, and it lasted for like a day. And it was very strange. But, for them, it's so much worse because they've eaten all the food and they've eaten the wheat, and I don't know what's going to happen. But the pioneers were so resilient, so I'm sure they'll find a way to make it through. Because I know that there's more books about this family, and I know that Laura lived to a ripe old age. So somehow they made it. We'll have to learn how. Okay, that was a long one. I'll talk to you guys. I'll read to you guys again soon.